everybody. And tonight we're going to speaking English. It's going to be an English-speaking lecture, not only to honor Amanda Rath, but also to honor our guests here from Florence tonight. And I'm really happy to welcome Amanda, who is going to speak to us tonight about one of the important aspects, as far as I'm concerned, that our artists here, the invited Indonesian artists, have all been revealing the importance of the collaborative practice in the artwork for contemporary Indonesian artists. Amanda Rath is a lecturer of modern and contemporary art of Southeast Asia in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies and the Institute of Art History at the Goethe-University in Frankfurt am Main. She received her PhD from Cornell University and has written and lectured throughout Southeast Asia, Germany, and the United States. She's an expert on Southeast Asian art. Her lecture will elaborate, is it not? Because you're looking so, no? Is it not true? It's true. Okay, listening to somebody else. Her lecture will elaborate on the developments in Indonesian's artistic landscapes, which are also gaining relevance in a global context. And to add, Amanda has been such a fundamental person and colleague in the development of this exhibition, as she has supported us strongly in writing the wall text and contextualizing the artist's work within the broader setting of the Indonesian society, of the Indonesian social and political context, especially for a German public that is not that familiar with the contemporary artistic production from Indonesia. So thank you again for having joined the whole process of our exhibition making and for talking to us tonight and giving us some further insights into Indonesian contemporary art. Thank you, Amanda.
Well, thank you very much to Franziska for that very nice intro. And thanks a lot, too, though, to Frankfurter Kunstverein for being so generous. And is this too close? This is good? That's good. For being so generous in having me, or inviting me to collaborate as well. It's been really a great time. If any of you had the chance to actually be here for the exhibition opening and the process of its beginning, it was really fantastic because the artists were here, and it was very nice to catch up with them. So this evening, actually, I am going to pare down the idea of collaborative practice in Indonesia to very specific art collectives. Okay, so it's just a snippet of what we could talk about in terms of collaborative practice in Indonesia. And if anybody's had my class before, some of the information, just some of it might be a little familiar to you. Some of my students are here. So basically, what I thought I would do is first let you know that this, like I said, this talk is really serves as an introduction rather than a sustained argument about the development and methodologies of so-called collective artistic practices, artist initiatives, and the related modes of collaboration in an Indonesian context. Okay, so in as much as this work is global and it's part of a global network, I will be paying very close attention to the Indonesian context. I will briefly discuss here the methodologies that they have attempted, in which they have attempted, artists, collectives, have attempted to redirect the relationship between art and the public into a relationship that emphasizes the political agency of the artist and the viewer rather than the legibility of the artwork itself. Similarly, curator Akwi Enwenzor, in his The Production of Social Space as Artwork, has written that, quote, "In collective work, we witness the simultaneous aporia of artwork and artist. This tends to lend collective work a social rather than artistic character." This is certainly the case regarding the few collectives that I will be discussing this evening. They are highlighted as examples of a more expansive constellation of art collectives and their collective art practices. They're also selected for what I believe are innovative means of bringing together artists, academics, and various social institutions and communities into interdisciplinary exploration and problem solving, and for the ways in which they have helped to rethink and reimagine the public and expand public space, in a specifically Indonesian context. I have selected them for their global reach as well. In many ways, the history of collective art practices and contemporary art more generally in Indonesia are intimately tied to the political history of the country. Now, as you can see from the text, this is where we begin our story, May 1998, when masses of demonstrators, the majority of which were students, basically descended upon the Parliament building. And this is actually symbolic of a break, a supposed break in artistic practice as well, a lot of which we'll talk about tonight. In May 1998, the so-called New Order government and its militaristic authoritarian regime under President Suharto crumbled. The country entered a period of what is called reformasi, or the early period of democratic reforms in Indonesia. This is roughly between 1998 and 2003, except the work we're going to talk about, or I will talk about today. Most of these collectives came out or formed in 1998 to 2001. Now I'm getting hot. As Doreen Lee has aptly described the situation in the early months following Suharto's resignation, thank you, quote, the past 3 decades of Indonesian politics has been disrupted, shaped and branded by popular mobilizations across the political spectrum, end quote. Here we see just 2 examples of artists who actually also joined the demonstrations, the pro-democratic demonstrations, that actually began in 1997. Here at the top, we see Tisna Sanjaya and Isa Perkasa and others that are involved in Jeprut. If I have time, I can tell you what Jeprut is, but just to let you know, it's kind of a loose membership of performance artists who sort of banded together in 1995. They're considered to be a previous generation to the 1998 shift that we'll be talking about this evening. And then Taring Padi, that was also a short-lived, well, not short, about five years of a collective that sort of elevated, if you will, recuperated some of the ideologies of the leftist party, or the leftist cultural organization of Lekra. They have since disbanded the Now, the Reformasi period was dominated by pro-democratic, leftist, and social justice movements led by student activists. Activism street politics became a familiar sight in Indonesia, broadcast over national media, inspiring numerous documentaries, films, and photography exhibitions. Activism has also began to be seen on the internet, and this is kind of a very important point here, because the internet was fairly new to most Indonesians at that time. More and more people, however, had access to personal technology, such as digital cameras, mobile phones, and laptop computers, all of which were used as key tools of mediatization, but also dissemination. In a way, it was Indonesia's spring. As Lee further suggests in her study of street art of the time, the arts of resistance against the New Order state galvanized young artists. They wanted to document and experiment with new modes of creative expression suitable for the new situation of political changes. The months directly following Suharto's resignation were quite tumultuous and included several cases of racial and religious violence across the country. It is perhaps understandable then that the aesthetics of this early time of reforms were raw and often self-consciously ugly, aimed at exposing the brutal truths of an authoritarian regime and expressing the artist's deep sense of disjuncture. Now what we have here, we have 2 very interesting examples of what I consider a staging of a spectacle of violence. It is, on the left-hand side, we have what they call themselves Performance Factory, and this performance group actually ended up going on to being the Hip Hop Jogja Foundation. So if any of you know the Hip Hop Jogja Foundation, rap group, Marzuki, the lead singer of the band, is here, suspended. And basically what is going on here is he invited, or the group invited, the public to actually come and give him electric shocks. Of course, we've seen this before. We've seen this in many other places around the world. However, this is very specific to this period of time in Indonesia. It is symptomatic of what was going on in 1998, directly following or in the early period of a post-Suharto era. Now, with this, Jompet, who is also right across the hallway, his work is right across the hall, he actually collaborated with this group back then as lighting manager. He's also the lighting manager for Teater Gracie. Here you also have Yo-Yo Gasmana, I swear to God, that's a real name, Yo-Yo Gasmana, who did a series of these events in Japan and Indonesia and elsewhere where, again, he invited people, as you can see, to actually, what do you call it? Like, not strangle him, but throttle him, and repeatedly until he basically would pass out. So what these are suggesting, though, is saying that Indonesians themselves, the common people, actually are also violent, that they're prone to violence. This is the argument that they're making. Now, whether you want to believe it or not, that's up to you. This is another piece. This piece is by Rath Officina, who is one of the members of Ruang Rupa, who we'll be talking about this evening. This video, as you can see, is called What? And for about 20 minutes, he smacks himself in the face with extreme force to the point where his face, by the end of this performance, is black and blue, and he is in complete delirium at this point. Again, and it's been purchased by the Guggenheim, New York. Again, this is symptomatic of the violence and the issues of corruption and gangster politics that were actually happening, the discussion that was happening publicly at the time. Now, this was just one, what I talked about before, just these few pieces. This was just one relatively short-lived stream of contemporary art in a post-1998 Indonesia. Alongside this was a more sustainable development happening, namely the art collective and their respective and overlapping collective art practices. Between 1998 and 2001, more than 20 art collectives were publicly formed in the cities of Bandung, Yogyakarta, and Jakarta alone. This includes Ruang Rupa in Jakarta, Ruang Mes 56, that is here, represented here, House of Natural Fiber, which is also in Yogyakarta, Apotek Comic and Taring Padi, and the Common Room, etc., etc. There are many of them. And what actually brings them in common, fundamentally, is that they are multimedia, they are new media art collectives, meaning that they are going to combine art, technology, science, education, and a number of different platforms and programs. This is something really quite different. It is very much a shift from what was happening even in the 1990s, the early 1990s. So all of these groups that I'm going to talk about, they don't take into account the other groups that actually formed in other places throughout the country. I'm just going to be dealing with the ones that are on Java, okay? And I'm so sorry to all those other art collectives, but someday I will talk about you. Many of them had short lifespans, often failing or disbanding because of a lack of funding, lots of management issues, and an open-door policy for its memberships, meaning that you really didn't ask people to commit. It's open-door policy so they could come as they wanted and participate as they wanted. And of course, funding for these things, for these events, it's or for these platforms, very expensive to run. So you either sell a lot of your own individual artwork or you get an international funding body to fund you. Now, understandably, collectives tend to emerge during periods of crises, in moments of social upheaval and political uncertainty within society. An undercurrent in these collectives has been the reappraisal of conditions of production, reevaluation of the nature of artistic work, and the reconfiguration of the position of the artist in relation to the economic, social, and political institutions. As Gustav Iskandar, a co-founder of the Bandung Center for the New Media Art, explains, quote, "After 1998, we were very skeptical about all government and ministry-related institutions, as well as the existing cultural organizations and established art practices. This also goes for the old way of handling artistic activities, used to accumulate power in terms of authorship with a signature. We felt that we needed an alternative approach. The existing hierarchical structure simply didn't work anymore for contemporary cultural practices. Now we can communicate everywhere and with anyone. Anyone can be the center and relate with others. We have to distribute the power and the information and the rights of authorship in order to liberate the discourse and allow power to circulate. And of course, a lot of this sounds rather utopian, but they actually were creating new structures of artistic practice and cultural production at this time, which we will see. Now this, I beg your pardon, I did not center the pictures. This is Ruang Rupa. Basically what I would like to show is just to emphasize here, if you can see, the type of space it is. You can see a lot of people coming together over a table and talking. There's a lot of discussion going on. It's incredibly informal. They actually rent houses. I will talk about that in a second. But if you could see, it's very informal. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion going on. Same here. This is Ruang Rupa. This is one of their artist residencies. It's an international artist residency for both curators and artists to come and play. Now, another practical reason why so many collectives emerged when they did at this time between 1998 and 2001 is simply because they could. During the New Order, the ability for artists to form groups and actively discuss political issues publicly was rather limited, if not actively discouraged. It is largely among the students on campuses that traditions of dissent, subversion, of underground activities took place during the New Order. Because laws were in place that allowed students to protest within campuses, but they were designed to prevent the opposition from spreading beyond the confines of the campuses. Most of these collectives emerged from the campuses among friends and cohorts who then rented a house for their activities. So you've got these friends, you're in university together, or art academy together, and you have similar like-minded ideals. You're talking about politics, society, cultural art, etc. You form a group, you rent a house together. And then they opened this house up to the public. So the rooms actually, the idea of house is important here because it's an intimate space, right? It's very intimate and it's very informal. And they wanted to replicate that and maintain this particular notion of the house, the communal house. Such informal and intimate settings have become the typical space and platform for a multitude of activities, They integrate the community among which they live and work. They engage in continuous process of negotiation and discussion with the immediate community of neighbors, and issues of private space and what is public space become sites of intervention. So it is a house within a neighborhood, and it's not just that you're getting along with your own collective, you also are negotiating terms with your neighbors. And so it's actually this question, a lot of the events that happen within these collectives are actually happening on the street, in somebody's living room, or someplace. So the idea of public and private are renegotiated consistently and amongst the neighbors themselves. So you have to have some kind of trust among yourself. It's a community of people who typically share the same social and economic status as well. This is something that's rather important. So it's not like, middle-class artist is actually moving into the middle of an incredibly poor area. So let's just keep it real, right? They're moving into similar social and economic settings at this particular time. Many of these collectives would have been unthinkable during the New Order, perhaps even have been labeled organisasi tanpa bentuk, or an organization without form. And this was actually used as a label to label things as unregistered, and by extension, a clandestine or illegitimate organization. So by contrast, many of the collectives today actually, such as these cultural centers like Kunci and Ruang Rupa, and et cetera, the Bandung Center for New Media, have officially registered with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights as non-profit organizations and foundations. This not only provides them with the legal accreditation that they need, it also makes them eligible for foreign funds, upon which the majority of collectives greatly depend. Now, interesting, the status of nonprofit organization has actually meant the imposition of a hierarchical structure imposed over what is typically a horizontal structure and mediating approach. Members of these multi-platform collectives carry titles such as director, research director, director of education, programming, etc. However, inasmuch as they need these titles to be considered a nonprofit organization or foundation, and that most funding bodies actually demand this kind of professionalism, the process itself still remains incredibly horizontal and informal. Now, now these are just some of their web pages. I wanted to show you just how multi-platform these collectives really are. As you can see here, the text is really super small. I apologize, but on the left-hand side there is, the main members of the group. But then this also tells you their different platforms. You have Art Lab, which some of you actually, when you were in last month during the Frankfurt Book Fair, perhaps some of you had time to play at the Art Lab at Musanton. Anybody? Ruang Rupa was here in October. So basically, these are their programs, and I'll talk about one of the programs. I'll talk about the Art Lab in a moment. But as you can see, they have the Art Lab, they have OK Video. Ruang Rupa actually instigated in 2003 the first video festival in Indonesia, which is now incredibly popular, and it is international as well. And they actually stress the use and the construction and the production of video, not video art, but video, as a tool not just for mediation for us via something external to us, but how we can actually narrate our own histories. So they actually go and work with different communities and help them learn how to video and edit, no matter how sophisticated or how cheap your technology is. The point is that you actually come to a point where you actually are narrating your own video story. Okay, and then here's House of Natural Fiber, or HUMF. To say HUMF, it's fun. This, as you can see, they also have various programs. So basically, what they have is a lot of international programs. They have interdisciplinary, transnational programs. They also, most of them have their own journal. Most of them have some kind of education program. These are very important, and this is something, again, that was very different from what was going on in the 1990s, where it was very difficult actually to construct a collective of artists, scientists, sociologists, communities, etc., into one thing called a collective. And then this is just some of the artists in residencies that have actually come out of Ruang Mas. Ruang Mas is actually an alternative photography collective, and so they actually look for experimental approaches to documentary photography and film. So, let's see. My lecture so far has introduced the foundations for the remainder of my talk, which I will discuss in brief some of the key methodologies and strategies deployed by certain collectives whose projects I feel are successful, critical interventions, and in effecting some kind of change. Now here we have, I didn't put a label on here. This is actually a combined collage. It's a collage of some projects by Apotek Komek. As I've suggested, one of the key strategies of concerns of these collectives is the reclamation and critical engagement with public space. This means expanding the idea of such space, expanding the idea of public space, as well as to rethink the public and its occupation of this space. This is crucial in a situation in which for decades public space and what could take place there to a certain extent was owned and dictated by the state. This includes the definitions and strategies used, strategic uses for street art. Okay, so now Apothecomic is basically one of the street art collectives, basically, that emerged in the mid to late 1990s. And at first it was covert, sorta. There was a little bit of risk there in terms of this, but what happens when suddenly the local government actually in Yogyakarta, after Suharto stepped down and there were a lot more freedoms of speech, they actually embraced this idea about, it's not graffiti, it's street art. So the city of Jogja, if you actually go to the city of Jogja, it is absolutely wrapped in murals. It's wrapped in street art. It's wrapped in text. I mean, it's a visual orgy, but still. Its streets are wrapped in imagery. And these are actually, for the most part, these are now sanctioned by the local government, whereas beforehand, it had a bit of a risk value to it. It had much more, what Apothecomic sort of argued was a little bit more of a political reason for carrying these out. What Apothecomic did, though, is they actually started a different kind of gallery. They created a public gallery. And the lower left hand, you get to see that. It's a public gallery. It's a wall in Jogja along a very busy street. And what they did was they actually invited artists and also the public to come with their own cartoons that they would then present and create their own street art. And it was a temporary gallery, so these things are very ephemeral, but it allowed the community to actually participate in wrapping the city in its own representation, its own chosen representation. And so this actually was a kind of a recycling, a cyclic gallery, right? Now, one of the artists actually who sort of made a name for himself by joining or at least participating quite a bit in this particular kind of collective mode of open gallery, of course, was Eko Nugroho. Now, Eko Nugroho, I'm sure you've seen his work. It's in this exhibition here. So what I thought I would do is just give you a couple of ideas about other things that that guy is doing. He's a very busy person, and he sort of has created his own brand now. He sells many, many products of different, from different platforms. And most of the proceeds, actually, of these businesses, if you will, a lot of the profits actually go to sending children to school. He actually has just now started with the profits of some of these marketable items that he creates. He's actually created an art school for kids. So it's not like, he doesn't pay back. He's paying a little bit back. So Eko Nugroho, one of the artists in the exhibition here at FKV, I just said, emerged onto the Jogja art scene at the beginning of Reformasi in the late 1990s, a key member of a diverse community of street artists in the city. One of the other leading street art collectives, as I just said, is Apothecomic. Now, with increased freedoms of speech in a post-Suharto Indonesia, the streets really did become open galleries. They became open spaces where they tried to get people to explore different approaches to the production of art in relation to public space. So they wanted to bring art out of the gallery and combine the idea of public space and art. Now, much of Nugroho's artistic practice is the result of his long-standing concern over demonstrating over the democratization potential in technologies of reproduction, in the production and dissemination of art, and its accessibility as a potential instrument and space of communication. These include his open gallery on paper called Daging Tumbuh. Now, Daging Tumbuh is here. What this is, Daging Tumbuh itself is also a manufacturer of embroidered stickers, embroidered badges, little things, little tchotchkes, that again go toward other projects. They can also sometimes they go to help artists as well to realize some of their dreams and hope for projects. Now, what Daging Tumbuh is, though, it originally started as an open gallery on print. Anybody, non-artist, artists alike, they could actually send in their cartoons, their comics. This is specifically a comic cartoon, actually comic-based medium. And then they just photocopied it. So it's incredibly cheap to reproduce, and you can reproduce it again and again and again. So this is part of his wish, his desire anyway, demonstration of the desire for the democratization of art, making something that's incredibly easy to disseminate. And it's also providing a place for people to exhibit their works. Okay. Here's just some more images, if you will, of the kind of discussions. This, again, is at Ruang Mes 56. Now, I'm introducing Ruang Rupa now. Ruang Rupa is a group, a collective that a lot of you already have heard about. Well, perhaps you've already heard about it. We just saw their website. It's a multi-platform project. It actually started in 1999, but it sort of officially went public in 2001. And it was while Adai Darmawan, who is considered the director of Ruang Rupa, actually, he was at Rijks Academy at the time. And Rijks Academy at the time was putting together the RAIN network, which is a network that supports similar-minded collectives in South America and Africa. So immediately, from the beginning, Ruang Rupa, or RURU for short, was connected to a global network via an international funding partner. Now, I put these particular images up because I want you to understand that Ruang Rupa actually, part of its fundamental premise is engaging the public space in Jakarta. The urban experience of Jakarta. It is a very specific experience in Jakarta. If you've never been to Jakarta, you have absolutely no idea what this is like. So this is Jakarta. Jakarta is, as he says, it is like a visual orgy. You are assaulted on a daily basis with gigantic billboards all the time. This is the cityscape. It's a very noisy visual scape. But on top of that, as you can see, traffic. Traffic is absolutely, that is what Jakarta is known for, unfortunately. So it is within this environment that Ruang Rupa begins its intervention. Now, the collective Ruang Rupa functions in this space. They must compete with this noise. So they ask themselves, how can you collectively intervene in such a space? They must always be thinking of ways to strategize and intervene in public space. This includes malls, disused urban space, offering different experiences of the city to the public and hopefully changing their awareness of the city in which they live. This is just a couple of images, again, of their space. This is post-meeting on the left-hand side. As you can see, very, very informal, nothing too posh. And then post-meeting. Okay. This is an image, actually, they just celebrated their 15th year. Ruang Rupa is now also having a branch. A branch of Ruang Rupa is now being planned for Sonnebrek in the Netherlands for 2016. So it is expanding globally, but they just celebrated their 15th, and this collage that they've done here is actually an impression from their 10th anniversary exhibition, in which they brought together a number of projects. And as you can see, a lot of these projects are documentation of research, okay? They're trying to actually shift the idea of what we would consider the object of art. These are research documents of their various platforms and also of the collaborations that they've had with a variety of groups. So, okay. This particular, I'm very fond actually of the idea of Art Lab. Art Lab is run primarily by Reza Afasina. And what it does is it actually goes into different communities, different situations, and they work with communities and ask them ideas about what concerns them the most, and then how can we actually start to represent this? How can you actually be active in representing your own history? So this project was in Australia. It was just recently in Australia in 2015 in Sydney. And the question was they actually approached a group of international students who came to the city to attend university. And so part of the thing is they wanted to figure out, okay, how can we represent this experience? They actually had to go in and they decided for themselves what aspects of their experience being foreigners in a city, their experiences of being lost, their experiences perhaps of alienation, etc. And the one thing that they decided upon is to actually sort of replicate, if you will, their experience via the dorm room. So about 6 guys basically live together in a dorm room because it's very expensive in Sydney. So, and so they started to create ways in which to narrativize, mediatize their experiences as so-called foreigners or strangers in Sydney and trying to get around. Just a couple of more examples of their platforms. Again, they have video platforms in which they involve a number of video collectives throughout Indonesia. And this is something that's really interesting about Ruang Rupa that, again, is a shift in what was happening prior to 1998. This Ruang Rupa and a couple of other art collectives actually strive very hard to connect with and collaborate with other collectives in Indonesia outside of Java. And this is actually quite unique, I think, to this particular period, is that oftentimes what happens is these other collectives and other artists outside of Java and Bali actually are marginalized. They're on the fringes, if you will. They're on the periphery of the national discourse, the national cultural discourse and artistic discourse. So they actually come and include them, and this is part of the Militia Project. They also, they do popular culture. I'm not going to go into sticker because I don't want to get too bogged down in time. And they also publish their own journal. It's a dual language. I've published in it a couple of times. And each time they actually take a particular theme, not about art, but about cultural production. And so they invite artists, scholars, researchers, scientists, and the community, et cetera, to respond by sending in to this journal. This is another project that it's kind of interesting, is that Ruang Rupa also likes to emphasize that which typically escapes the attention of most people in Jakarta. One thing that doesn't escape people's attention, of course, is the market. However, these are so-called secret markets. These are night markets that bounce around because they're not legit, they're not registered. And so, but this is part of the culture, the nightlife, the very culture of Jakarta, and it's part of our urban experience. And so they went and they started to document them. They actually made maps and GPS locations of all of these particular so-called illegal or secret markets, making them available, just acknowledging their very existence, giving them legitimacy to a certain extent. And then they restaged them. They actually asked a lot of these markets to actually just come together. Not a single market sits down the street over here, maybe 2 blocks over there and a mile over there. They actually came together to produce one large so-called secret market. And hence, a lot more people were able to experience a certain aspect of Jakarta urban experience that maybe would have passed them by. It brings different people together, deliberately bringing different groups of people together that may not normally have access to each other. Here's a couple more. What they do. Jakarta 32 degrees centigrade is a project that also, it has an educational component. They actually work with about 10 universities throughout Indonesia. They work with the students to come. They have workshops. Again, the same thing. It's dialogue-oriented. And through this dialogue and negotiation, then a theme actually emerges and arises, and these students from these universities then create works together. And it doesn't matter the outcome. What happens is the process. It's the dialogue that actually means the most. Getting these students, getting these young people together to actually talk about current issues that affect them as Jakartanese in the city. And then their works actually end up exhibited in the National Gallery. Right, that's the National Gallery. I don't know how I feel about that because, here you have a bunch of students that come together as part of a workshop and a dialogue, and they're constructing narratives, they're constructing projects together, and then those projects are publicized in the National Gallery. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but This is one of the last projects, actually, that I'm going to be talking about, and then what I'm hoping is that you, in the audience, you'll have questions for me about if I haven't explained anything, maybe you want something more in depth, or maybe you have a critical question, that would be great. So I'm looking forward. The last group that I'm talking about tonight actually is the House of Natural Fiber. House of Natural Fiber in itself was, like so many of these art collectives, it was begun in 1999. And it is an example, it really is actually, for me, it's an excellent example of a new media collective that represents social problems of local communities while also attempting to provide creative solutions to such problems. This is an intensely interdisciplinary group of artists, designers, computer programmers, biologists, and other scientists, as well as sociologists. They collaborate with a variety of social institutions and communities to work together in creating interdisciplinary research and education programs. It is a laboratory. It's a laboratory that focuses on the interconnections between art, technology, education, and society. And as of 2010, House, or HUNF, established its own Fab Lab. Does anybody know what a Fab Lab is? Somebody tell me.
I thought it's actually something where you learn specific techniques to, for example, build a mobile phone, and then they teach you, and everybody's invited to learn the technique, and then afterwards you don't have to buy it from a big company, but you do it yourself, and
Right.
where to get the parts, and how to get the parts in a fair kind of way, and then build your own stuff.
Right. It's an exactly, yeah. You have a little bit more empowerment, as it will, in the construction of your own cultural production and in objects that you use on a daily basis and your access to them. Now, the idea of Fab Lab is also that each lab, because it's actually an international project, you have labs all over the world. And each lab has to have exactly the same availability of materials and tools and techniques and training. So that if I'm here and I send my prototype, I send my idea to Africa, they should be able to make it. And they should be able to make it out of anything. For example, if I have a lamp and I say, I want you to make this out of cardboard, you should be able to make it out of cardboard. You should be able to make it out of different materials. And what this is actually sort of sidestepping a lot of the processes of production. Right? Because if you can actually go to somebody directly and say, I have a product and will you help me make it? Here's my prototype, and they will make it for you. Each lab should be able to make exactly the same thing, right? Across the board. I should be able to send it to a lot of people. But this particular project, there are two things about House of Natural Fiber. I picked two of my favorite projects of theirs. One of them is called the Intelligent Bacteria, and I'm so sorry, I feel like an idiot because I cannot remember what the other one is called. But Intelligent Bacteria, for that, they actually worked with microbiologists at the University of Guatemala to actually create this. And the second one, they again worked with scientists. Here they worked with agricultural experts and also communities of rice farmers throughout Indonesia. Now, these are just the last two things I'm going to talk about, so we have a few more minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this one first. Intelligent Bacteria began from a social reality, actually, in Indonesia, where people were actually buying bootleg hooch, alcohol that actually was making people blind or kill you. Like, bam. That's some pretty strong stuff. So what they decided to do, it's like, okay, we don't want to make people stop. We don't want to have people stop drinking, but we would like to make it so that they can make their own hooch so that they don't get poisoned. So they actually set about working with microbiologists to figure out how do you actually properly ferment something into alcohol, right? And I can't imagine that this stuff tastes good, but I mean, if you're going to have hooch, you might as well have hooch that's not going to kill you. And so what they did was they actually made the entire process the actual work itself. This is just mere documentation, and it's actually this is documentation of a work that actually kept happening. It actually kept the process going because the fermentation itself just kept going during the exhibition. They made it a kinetic piece. This is where the artistic side comes in, because so far what we've seen a lot of is that these projects actually oftentimes, for critics, it actually tilts the scales towards social criticism. And oftentimes the artistic side, a lot of people would argue we miss that. There's not that balance. There's no artistic critique. There is an artistic side to this, and and for a long time, their projects actually they documented the process itself by putting that very apparatus inside the gallery itself. So they put microphones on the fermentation bottles. They've done this a couple of times in different places, and you can hear it. You can hear the dropping of the fermented drops, the liquid within the bottles. You can hear it go bubble, 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 boop, 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 and the hissing and things like that. And they really make the process absolutely transparent. The process of production is transparent. And this is another thing that you have to underscore with these art collectives, the idea of transparency in the process of production. That's why the Fab Lab for some people is so fabulous. Now, on the left-hand side, this project is still ongoing. It is in Indonesia after the rice harvest, and after the rice is actually taken out of its husks, you're left with hay, kind of hay or straw, and usually it's typically burned. It's burned. And so it goes up into the air, haze, how much fun. Plus, it's a waste. So the people at Humph actually got together again with scientists and also communities of rice farmers and asked them, okay, let's figure out how we can actually turn this into a sustainable energy source. Right? So they're working towards, can we use fermentation? How many hectares of Indonesian rice land is there, and how much can we assume of the bulk of the hay can we use for energy production? So it actually became a scientific research that involved many, many different experts in the field to actually create a sustainable energy source while also constructing something that in the end would be presented in an exhibition space. However, again, this is the apparatus that's actually tracking the research data. And in this case, they actually used an Indonesian satellite to find out where the fields are that they could actually, that might be, could be used actually. Where is the smoke? And so they actually, here's the data, you can actually see, and it was ongoing continuously because the data kept coming in as the exhibition, as the work stayed in the exhibition space. The data just kept coming in, so it was constantly changing. This is a self-sustainable project. It does not require an artist anymore. It's self-sustainable. And this is one thing that House of Natural Fiber is trying to establish, is projects that even though there is an object at the end, something that actually, in this case, is going to be exhibited, so to speak, that these projects themselves are so transparent and that they are so they can be continued. You do not need the artist. So this is, again, it's not the defacing of the artist, but it is dispersing the authority of the artist within these collectives. So basically, I'm going to conclude because I am now at my 43 minutes. Artist-run spaces and collectives. The fact that so many of them have been able to survive indicates their ability to connect and relate to local context and its specific needs. Living and working among a certain community reflecting similar level of economic and social status, the idea of living together, this offers an ideal relationship between the local community and the artist and the collective. Artist-run spaces and collectives have been crucial, absolutely crucial, for contemporary art and its discourse to evolve in Indonesia. They provide needed space for experimentation and for developing new artistic practices, as well as a counter to the exclusionary system of the commercial gallery. Because we have to remember, in Indonesia lacks the institutions that might be viable spaces to tamper the force of the art market. It does not have an art museum. It has a national art gallery, but that's pretty much like a space for rent, I mean, in terms of exhibitions. So if you have a place that has, you're lacking the institutions, and what you have is a very, very strong, heavy art market, these spaces actually do provide an alternative, a space for you to explore, to experiment.